It's strange to sit in here and sort of seeing the clock over there twitching with the last bits of battery that has left, and it's like the things that indicate Erwin's life as being active are slowly kind of dwindling away. And it also means, the question of like what happens now. Yeah, I remember Erwin cutting out pictures out of the newspaper of refugees packed onto ships, and he would always just sort of shake his head and put his head down and say that it was all so terrible. A small example of the way Erwin felt about the refugee status relates to something as simple as the National Gallery listing his status as being migrated to Australia as a line, and he questioned whether or not migration was the correct term when you're a prisoner. The content of the drawings and the way that some of those drawings related to the issue of the refugee, that was something that Erwin was experiencing in the things he saw on the news or the things he read in the newspaper, and his own experience of that and how he could tie that together. I think the word legacy would make Erwin's skin crawl. He did believe in what he was doing, and he wanted that to represent him. It holds something that captivates people in and of itself.
I'd say that photo was taken in 1937 in Novi Ligure with my mother, obviously saying something funny, but I'm looking at the sky and I'm sure it wasn't an aeroplane, so it must have been a bird, but I look very happy there, and she does too. And the next one is taken at Chugga Mine with my mother and Alfred Figdor holding my monkey, and the British mining people in front of the house we actually lived in. The war was declared. I think you actually have a copy of a letter saying we were enemy aliens and would we please present on the ship. So we went straight to the Queen Mary. My mother said it was a very cushy ride. Then landed in Sydney and from there to Tatura. I remember them looking after us and taking us on picnics and things, and I certainly remember the barbed wire, but never with fear. The first time, because I had long hair and leather shoes and different clothes, and I came home and said to my mother, I've got to have my hair cut and I've got to get a school tunic. I want shoes with no laces, and I've got to have this pin here with a rag hanging, which is the handkerchief. And I realised it was a reflection probably of the society at the time, and my mother said, no, you're not doing that. You've got to wear leather shoes, and she did cut my hair and got me a school tunic. So I did feel an outsider, and certainly by the time I got to high school, I was aware I didn't fit in anywhere.
The Dunera, in my memory, was not as frightful as it is portrayed. It is very often portrayed. I must admit I was a young guy of 17. I'd slept on 10 tents on the floor, didn't worry me. In internment, I improved my English enormously. We had a library that was sent to us by members of the Jewish, Protestant and Catholic congregations in Melbourne, and I read a lot. And then I started to prepare for the Victorian matriculation exams, but of course there was Pearl Harbor. Australia was at war with Japan, and they asked for volunteers to pick fruit in Mona and then join the army if we wanted to. And I put my hand up, so I didn't have the chance to sit for the 2 mathematics exams, which I did my army correspondence course and passed before the war finished, so that when the war finished I had matriculated at Melbourne University, and the Army gave me a scholarship to study there. And I found a job that I liked, which was teaching English to migrants coming to Australia. I have no objections meeting Germans who fought in the war on the other side, because it seems to me if I had different parents, I would have believed what the others believed. Yeah, and I might have died in Stalingrad, how do I know?
You could hardly have had a more difficult introduction to art history than Franz's fine art bee. Franz is a very intimidating teacher to many undergraduates. Well, Franz shamelessly had his favourites, and the chief of which was indeed Jenny Anderson.
You know, Franz was the embodiment of what I wanted to know about, which was the Italian Renaissance. And he gave these lectures every week, and I loved it. I worked terribly hard. We went to the NGV quite a lot to look at paintings. So that was my introduction to Italian Renaissance art, which I've pursued ever since.
The great thing about Franz was, as you ceased to be an undergraduate and you moved on in life, he became a marvellous friend. And he had a great gift of friendship for former students. And I became increasingly fond of him.
You know, he treats you as an equal and someone, he makes you believe in yourself as a teacher, and that's very important.
I think it was a profound sense of trauma. And that's where, when he got to Australia, and he really, when he got out of the wretched internment camps at Tatura and places like that, he found the University of Melbourne with Max Crawford as the professor of history, really like a paradise. And here was really people who had high standards, serious interest and inquiry. And then this phenomenal stroke of luck comes along, whereby Keith Murdoch gets to give the money to set up a Department of Fine Arts. And it is to Joe Burke's enduring credit that he saw how good Franz Philipp was and appointed him it really was his first appointment to the finance department. Nobody's ever written a better book, monograph, on an Australian artist than Franz Philipp on Arthur Boyd. I think what he wanted most to convey was the richness of the objects themselves. And he loved art, there's no question about that. He was an art lover. But he wanted to make sure that we saw it in as rich and as deep a cultural and historical setting as it was possible for him to muster. What he really brought to Australia and brought to his students was the full degree of high seriousness which exists in European art history. And that high seriousness can go along with a great delight and pleasure in the works of art themselves.
Well, I suppose he applied the aspects of the discipline of art history to a contemporary Australian artist whom he knew, and both in his stylistic analysis and his understanding of his work, and that sort of thing. So it was a very important book for establishing a text about a contemporary Australian artist. I don't think we have anything of that significance for Nolan, for example.
I never heard him make one adverse comment about what a terrible place Australia was and how terrible the standards were and so on. He just stuck to his sky-high standards in scholarship and teaching, and if you didn't catch on, that's your problem.
It was a horrible nightmare worship because the guards were bastards. Every one of them were bastards. They pinched everything we had. They threw everything we had overboard. I was the youngest. I was protected by a German seaman who was also interned, who had been on a merchant ship a German one, which was sunk by the British, and he was taken prisoner. Matheson was liked on the ship, and he had the privilege of peeling potatoes. Peeling potatoes meant we could be on the deck near the galley, and really had that job every day. And he shared that job with me sometimes. Whereas all the others were locked up down in the belly of the ship. It was dark and miserable and crowded. So I came ashore in Australia with one pair of trousers, tied up with a string, and had sandals made out of a rubber tire, and a shirt without a collar, and a scarf which belonged to my dear old poor mother who died in Auschwitz. That's all I had when I came to Australia. It was a difference like day and night, because once the Australian soldiers understood where we came from and who we were, they were quite decent to us. We were on a train going all the way to Hay. And when I told one of the soldiers that I was a Jewish refugee from Hitler, he said, "Why the bloody hell did they intern you?" In the camp, that was a good and a bad time at the same time. But you mustn't compare that camp with a concentration camp. We had a school, we had our own cooks, we had our own carpenters, we had our own gardeners. Very shortly, we had organized ourselves into a kind of community. The best time in that internment camp was when I was allowed out to ship level from the Murrumbidgee River and then jump into the water and have a swim, where the guard who should have looked after me sat under a gum tree and smoked a cigarette and put his rifle beside him, and he thought to himself, let him swim where he can swim to, he can't get away with it, he'll come back.
When I hear refugee people talk today, I realise how different the whole situation was.
From the point of view of reason, I think they're in a very similar situation. They have it's more difficult for them.
Compared to these, who were very privileged refugees. Once we freed ourselves from Hitler Germany, which was the greatest disaster the Jews ever lived through, we were privileged in the sense that the countries we came to gave us a chance to be somebody, to start anew.
If Erwin saw a photo of people on a boat, jammed together, he saw people. It was never a question of them and us. It's more the brutality of what leads people to such a circumstance. And he understood well enough that it was always like institutions that were like the most, governments and institutions are always the thing that is the core of corruption in the world.
Oh, very Australian, yeah. But not, I don't want to go out and wave a flag. I want people to welcome everyone, and I think we'd be a healthier society if we did. On their terms, not always on ours. Yeah.